We're continuing the series on Hebrews that we've been doing for quite a few weeks now. I don't even remember how many weeks it's been. Um, we won't be ever going through the whole book of Hebrews. It's a big book, and these studies are taking quite a while, and I'll probably start jumping in the future to specific areas. But we've been following it straight through, and we're into chapter 5 now, or we will be into chapter 5. We're just finishing off the end of chapter 4. And we'll continue on a little bit after that, and then we'll see where we go after all of those things are done. But it's been a good study, I think. Hebrews has a lot to tell us. But before we get into today's lesson, I want to bring up a topic that Cynthia started last week. And I think it's a good one to bring up. And that is the idea of what's the difference between rest and peace? What is rest exactly? And what is peace exactly? And is it possible to have rest without peace? And the answer is certainly yes. And so we see rest and peace mentioned in the Bible in many places. And rest, we see the word meaning ceasing from work. And it's really talking about physical life work. It's not a spiritual rest that we're talking about. It's a rest of your body, and it's also a rest of your mind. And your mind is a product of your brain. And so both of those things are really physical, although our mind doesn't seem like such a physical thing. So the rest of the Bible talks about is that rest from mental and psychological things, and also the rest from physical things. So that is the way that the Bible looks at rest, as really mostly a physical or metaphysical thing, if you want to think of the mind as a metaphysical thing. And it's something that we require. We get tired, we wear down, we need these breaks, and God designed us so that we need a break every seventh day. And that works out to be the seventh day Sabbath that he chose for us to have that break. And we need it. And so the work that we're ceasing from when we rest is the work that's required to feed ourselves, to sustain ourselves and our families, and earn the money in the paycheck and bring the bread home and all that sort of stuff that we have to do in our normal lives. And so that's what rest is. It's a ceasing from work, and that's intended as a physical or mental thing. And this has been required since Adam and Eve. Remember when we covered that study, it's been necessary for us to be able to work, and that's required for us to live. And otherwise, if we don't work, we don't live. And from the time of creation, it's been that way. And at creation, God rested from his works. But we don't see peace being mentioned as part of that. It just talks about that being a rest that he took when he was done creation. And so we use rest and peace together in a couple of different ways. One of them is Shabbat Shalom, which is rest and peace. And that's the kind of rest of ceasing from work that we're talking about. So in using them together like that, we know that they're not the same thing. They're different things. And we also use it in another way that's a little less biblical, let's say. And that is when a person dies, sometimes we will say rest in peace. And so what do we mean when we say that? He's obviously resting in the sense that no longer does he have to work to feed himself. The rest of physical life is done for him. And so he is resting. He doesn't have to work anymore to sustain himself. And that might seem a little ghoulish, but we won't go there. So he's resting, but does he have peace? It would be the question with that. And the answer can be yes or no, and that depends on the life that he's lived. When we did the study about afterlife and what happens after death, we talked about the existence that we enter into when we die. And some people are at peace, yes, but other people are not at peace. And we saw that. And so you can have rest with peace and you can have rest without peace. And they're different things that we see through that. So having talked about rest a little bit, I'll talk about peace some more. And peace isn't often the way humans define it. It isn't not the absence of war. Peace is something different from that. And Jesus talked about that. He said, my peace I give to you. And that comes from John 14:27. He says, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. It is not as the world gives that I give to you. Do not let your heart be troubled, and do not let it be afraid. So true peace, the peace that Jesus gives, is something that comes from inside you. It's a spiritual peace. And it should be in your life something that moves into the physical you from your spiritual you. And so this peace is an internal thing. And so even in hard times, even when people are going crazy all around you and there are bills that need to be paid and the kids need to be helped with their homework and there are chores to do and things, all that stuff of life. There should still be a peace within us. We should be able to dig down and find that peace, that inner peace. And joy is the same way. Joy should be just like that for us. There should be a joy deep inside of us, a spiritual joy that we have that is there. Now, it's sometimes things are just not joyful, and it's hard to find that. But that should be down there and should be hiding in it, and should bubble up from time to time. And that joy should be something that we live with and experience in our lives. So peace and joy are kind of similar in that way, in that they come from the spiritual and they work their way into the physical. So we should feel them as physical happiness and peace, or not peace, but joy and peace. Yes. So true peace is a spiritual peace. It's not the kind of peace that the world tries to give you. The world tries to force peace and joy into you from the outside, and that's not something that can ever succeed. And if when you think about it, one of the groups of people that kill themselves early is comedians. And so we ask, well, why? Comedians should be the happiest people on earth. Why are they killing themselves? Why is the suicide rate so high for them? And really, I think the answer is that you can't force happiness inside. You can't force joy inside. And to be real, it needs to come from the inside and then be experienced on the outside. So I hope that makes some sense. Rest and peace are different things. One is much more physical, and peace is much more spiritual. So continuing on to our study then. And we're in chapters, we're going to be in chapter 4, running right away into chapter 5 here. And chapter 4 is picking up where we left off. We had just talked about the Sabbath there, and we were just getting into this idea of Jesus being a high priest. And that's where we pick it up. So the verse says, because we have therefore a great high priest, Yeshua, the Messiah, the Son of God, who has ascended to heaven, let us hold fast to his confession. And we had seen this, Jesus being called high priest before in earlier chapters. And when we were looking at the attributes of Jesus and who he was, Son of God, right hand of God, all those sort of things that we saw with Jesus, one of the things that was mentioned just kind of casually is that he was also a high priest. And what we're going to see now happening is he's going to dig into that high priest aspect more. We're going to be talking about that quite a bit in this lesson, and even a little bit going on in some future lessons. And so what he's doing here is he's doing what we call a segue. He's moving from one topic to the next topic, and he's kind of found a smooth path to work from one into the other. And that's what a segue is. So he's finishing up where he was left off. He's concluding that last lesson, but he leads into this next topic of the high priest. And he's making the point right here in these verses, or this verse, that Jesus is the great high priest. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. He ascended to heaven, and he mentioned all these things earlier, and so he's kind of doing a little bit of a wrap up of the points that he's covered earlier about who Jesus was. And he goes on further to say, he says, who else are you going to hold on to? Hold fast to his confession. He is all these things. Who else would you hold on to? It wouldn't make any sense to hold on to anybody else. And now he's going to begin talking more about how Jesus is a high priest to us. And some of these things we kind of touched on in the past, but he's going to dig deeper into these as we go through it. So Hebrews 4:14 through 16 says, for we do not have a high priest who cannot suffer with our weaknesses, but one who was tempted in all things like we are, apart from sin. Let us come therefore publicly to the throne of his grace to receive mercy, and we shall find grace to help in a time of suffering. So one of the things that we see here a lot is this reference to suffering, and that's something that we talked about a few lessons back too, is that we have this in common with Jesus. He is a brother to us. If you remember when we were covering how Jesus is our brother, and one of the ways that he is our brother is he went through the same suffering and temptations that we go through, and so we have that as a common factor to him. And so this idea of suffering and temptations is something that we live in our lives, something that Jesus also lived in his lives, but he didn't sin, and that's the difference between us. That is one thing that gives us a common base with Jesus. He is not just a great high priest, but he's a great high priest who has been through the same things. He's experienced all of these temptations and sufferings that we do. Now, there's an interesting word here that I've marked out in yellow, and I'll leave it up to you to try to understand what's being said there. But he says, let us therefore let us come therefore publicly to the throne of his grace and receive mercy. And so why is he saying public here? And I'll let you think about that one, but I think that there's an important aspect of receiving grace and mercy that requires some public aspect to it. And I'll just kind of leave that there for you to think about. Okay, continuing on. Now we're jumping into Hebrews 5. We caught just those last 3 verses of Hebrews 4, and now we're into Hebrews 5. For every high priest of the children of men was appointed for the sake of men over the things that are of God, to present offerings and sacrifices for the sake of sin, who can humble himself and suffer with those who are ignorant and erring, because he is also clothed with weakness. So he's saying here that Jesus is like the Aaronic high priest, the priest that came from Aaron. And remember, Aaron was the first high priest under that covenant. And in that, they are also of men. They are children of men. They are humans like we. And so they have the same things that we have. They experience the same sufferings and temptations that we have. And so they are in charge of the things of God. And we know that they were in charge of the temples and the teachings and the things that they were supposed to do in there. They presented offerings and sacrifices for sin for the people. And they can humble and understand the weaknesses of people because they are people who have seen these same weaknesses. So the author is saying that Jesus, as the high priest, has these things in common with us. He is like the high priests who were human in that they had these same weaknesses, they had these same duties, they had these things. And remember that Jesus, on his death, presented his blood as the atoning sacrifice for all of us. So in that way, he was like a priest. So he's saying that Jesus as a high priest is not so different from the Aaronic high priests. He has roles that he does as part of that. But of course, he's different from them in some ways, and that's going to be what we talk about next. And he says, and now he's still talking about these men who were high priests, not about Jesus, but of men who were high priests. And the verse says, and he owes a debt, this priest owes a debt for his own sake, that as for the people, in this way also for his own sake, he will make an offering for his sins. So he's talking about those priests who were humans also sinned sometimes as we do. They were human and therefore they sinned. It's just the nature. And so when that happened, they had to make an offering or a sacrifice for themselves, for their own sins. And in fact, their sacrifice was a greater sacrifice. They had to sacrifice an oxen. People like us, ordinary people, only had to sacrifice a goat or a lamb, or goat or a sheep, I should say. And so, but as people, they had that sin nature built into them as we do, and sometimes they would sin, and they had to make up for it in the same way that we had to. So he's saying, but here's the difference between the great high priest Jesus and the high priests who are human, in that he didn't have to do these things because he didn't sin. So continuing on here, talking about this great high priest idea still, he says, and it was not for himself that a man priest took the honor, but he who was called by God, just as Aaron was. So neither did the Messiah glorify his soul to be high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And as he said in another place, now the author here is quoting different verses. He says, you are a priest for eternity in the image of Melchizedek. And this Melchizedek is something that we're going to spend a fair bit, or the author spends quite a bit of time on. Therefore, we're going to spend some time on it too. And so what he's saying here is men didn't become high priests to glorify themselves. At least that's not the way it was supposed to work. We do see in the Bible in Jesus' time it had become that thing. High priests were taking on those positions of power and authority to glorify themselves. They were supposed to be called to serve. That was their duty, not to be glorifying themselves with the position that they had. And the author is saying here, likewise, Jesus didn't do it for the glory of being in that position. It was God who called him son and called him priest. And he quotes those two verses there. So he's saying that no high priest was ever supposed to be in it for the honor of that position or to glorify himself by having that position. It was always supposed to be that they were a servant. And we know that Jesus was a servant as well. That was part of his role. So now into Melchizedek. We're going to spend a little bit of time here. And he mentioned it back there. He's going to mention it again. And then even later on, he's going to mention it again in Hebrews. And we're only going to cover some of those today. But he says this Melchizedek is an odd character. The only reference here is from Genesis 14:18 through 20. And I'll read that for you. It says, oh, let me give you some background first. What has happened here is Abraham lives in an area with his sons. One of those sons is Lot. Lot lives in a town called Sodom. You remember Sodom and Gomorrah. They're going to come up in this story. So there are a bunch of towns there. Each town has its own king, it's called in the Bible. They're leader of their town. And these towns often war with each other and attack each other. And what has happened here is some of these kings have banded together and they've attacked Sodom and Gomorrah and overthrown them. And they've raided them. They've taken all their possessions and their food and people. They've taken a bunch of people too. And one of the people they took was Lot, because Lot lived in that town. And so they've captured all these people and took them off. And so Abraham, who is a wealthy man and has a large number of people that are part of his extended family, the servants mostly, who were born there. In fact, the Bible says something more than 300 men he has that he can bring up as warriors. And these 300 men plus himself all go out and attack these kings who attacked Sodom and Gomorrah to get back the property and especially to get back Lot, who is his nephew. And so they attack these people who've done this and conquer them and take back all of the stuff. And then we get to this verse in Genesis 14. And it says, okay, so Abraham's returning with all of the stuff that had been stolen, and along with that, Lot and a whole bunch of other servants. And so the verse 14:18 through 20 says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So Abraham gave him a tithe of everything that he had captured in this battle. And so this Melchizedek, we hear that he's a priest of God, and not just any old God that they had, but he was God Most High that he was a priest of. And this verse here gets, or part of it gets repeated by David in the Psalm, and we'll see that also. But this becomes a focal point of problems between early Christians and Jews. And we're seeing that here in Hebrews. Hebrews says that this Melchizedek was an important character because of what he represents. And so what does he represent? We see that this is the only reference to him as a living person. So we know nothing more than what this verse, these two verses here, show of him. And so we also have to do that thing that I asked you to do so many times, is ask the question, why is this text even in the Bible? Why is this little story about these people raiding? Raiding went on all the time, and why is this raid important? And so why is all of this story even being related to us in the Bible? And the answer is that telling us something that's important. This is the only reference where we hear of a priest of God prior to Aaron. And so this tells us that God had been choosing priests before Aaron. And we don't know of any others, but we know that there was at least this priest. And it's kind of an indication here that Abram knew of him. He knew this guy was a priest of God. And he was well known, and he was doing the priestly kind of duties prior to Aaron. So the importance of this verse is that it tells us that God had been choosing priests long before Aaron was chosen. This event with Melchizedek happened something like almost 500 years before Aaron. So that's why it's important. And the author of Hebrews is using that to say that Jesus, as a great high priest, is in the line of Melchizedek. He's not a priest like Aaron was a priest. He's a priest like Melchizedek was. And that's the problem that the Jews are going to be having with this. Let me not jump ahead of myself. I'll jump to the next slide instead. So what Psalm says about this Melchizedek is also a very short piece, but it's also very important. It says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So some translations translate that a little differently. They say the image of Melchizedek, or in the pattern of Melchizedek, or like Melchizedek. But it's really the same thing they're saying. He is a priest in that same form, that same style. He was a person who was called directly by God. He's not like Aaron. Well, Aaron was called by God too, but he was part of a different covenant. And so paraphrasing this, you can say that what the psalmist is saying is, you are a priest forever in the same way that Melchizedek was a priest. So the author of Hebrews says this passage is about Yeshua. It's a prophecy about whom Yeshua will be. And not just that he would be a priest, and not just any priest, he would be a priest forever because he cannot die. Unlike all the other men who were priests, they died. And it's important to remember here that Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And so it may not be a literal name for this person. It may be more of a title that's given to him. And we may not know his real name. But in any case, he was a special person, and the author of Hebrews is going to reference him quite a bit. And so we need to understand that Psalms backs that up, and he says that there was an order of Melchizedek, and that implies that there were other priests like Melchizedek who had been chosen by God to serve a priestly function prior to that covenant where Aaron was declared to be the first of the priests. And in that covenant, there were many priests who followed on, high priests and other priests.
Stan,
Yeah.
I remember Abraham running into him, and he acknowledged him as a higher priest, and he gave him his tithes and offerings.
Exactly.
But it's interesting, but I agree with you in the sense that Jesus was not after the order of the Levitican order, but after Melchizedek, that order. And I don't know how often this guy pops up, later on, but he is a man, but I think he has a very special order that others have been following the lineage, and Jesus eventually, or Yeshua eventually becomes that a priest in that order. So he's a lot higher, but as you said, he doesn't die, so he's forever a priest.
Right. Yeah, he's different that way. Yeah, and you've actually seen it now. Every reference in the Bible to Melchizedek, you have seen now. There is that Genesis reference, and his name appears once in those 3 verses. There's this Psalm reference, and there are no other references to Melchizedek. So you'd think he's a minor player, but in fact, he represents an important concept that there were priests prior to Aaron. And because of the way God works and the function of these priests, you would expect that there would have been priests, many priests, to help people with the things that they needed help with, teaching, sacrifices, all those sort of things, doing right. And so it just makes sense that he was, as the word says, the order of Melchizedek, which implies a sequence of priests. So, yeah, that's exactly right. So, but the problem here comes with Judaism. The Jewish translation of this is completely different, and you can still find that. Well, let me not jump ahead again. It's quite different, and the way they translate it is, you are a priest forever because of the speech of Melchizedek. And that's an unusual translation. The word that is translated as order of Melchizedek, or sometimes the line of Melchizedek, that word in all the other places where it's used in the Old Testament doesn't mean speech. And so they've kind of found a unique way of understanding this word and put it, made it into the speech of Melchizedek. And what's happening here is, after Jesus' death, as people began to understand that Jesus was the great high priest, and that's what the author here of Hebrews is talking about in teaching. The Jews didn't like that idea. They didn't like the idea of Jesus. They had killed him, and they were stomping out Christianity as much as they could, and separating it from Judaism as much as they could. And so they didn't like this idea that Jesus was a great high priest from a different order. And so what they did, without any biblical support, is they fabricated a story about this, a background story for Melchizedek. And they claimed that Melchizedek was actually Shem, the son of Noah. And so he was somebody special. He wasn't just another priest in a long line. He was the only priest that there ever was like this. And he was somebody that God had picked special. And he had lived for a long time, from the time of before the flood until the many years that he lived. Remember, he was one of the long-lived people still from the old generation. And so they're saying that this Melchizedek was actually Shem, the son of Noah. But he made a huge mistake here in this Genesis story, they say. In blessing Abraham, before he blessed God, he had sinned, a really big sin. And so because of this big sin of doing things in the wrong order, the title of priest was taken from him, and later it was given to Aaron 500 years later. And so they believe that David, when he talks about this priest who is going to be in the order of Melchizedek, he's really saying that Aaron would become a priest in because of what Melchizedek said. Okay, because he said the things in the wrong order, that Aaron was going to become a priest. So you can see that twisting, and we've talked about twisting before in this Hebrews series. We talked about it with the Sabbath and how verses 4:9 and 4:10 get twisted around by people who don't want to accept the Sabbath. The exact same thing is happening here, but in this case, it's the Jews who are doing this twisting. And so they found a way and a word that they can use to twist around, and they're using it to deny the fact that Jesus was a great high priest or anybody special at all. And so this is something we see in our own lives too. People find all sorts of reasons not to do what the Bible says. And they'll find some reason that's good enough for them, and they'll use that to reject the things that they don't want to hear. And that's human nature. So, but this continues on here. So why do the new Jews need this story? Why do they have this story at all about Melchizedek being Shem and about him speaking things in the wrong order and losing his title as priest because of it? And well, it wouldn't have mattered except for Jesus. It would have just been too small a thing to even mention. Who's this Melchizedek? Who cares? But it matters because of what the psalmist David said about him. He said that this person of prophecy is going to be a priest for eternity in the image of Melchizedek. So that made it matter to the Jews, and so they had to do something about that. And so they took these two verses, the one from Psalms and the one from Genesis about Melchizedek, and found a way to twist it around. And so we've seen these two verses here already. This idea of you are a priest for eternity in the image of Melchizedek. So the Jews made up this whole story to counter the claims of Christians that Jesus was a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. See, the problem is that Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. He wasn't from the tribe of Aaron, of Levi. He wasn't a person who could have been a priest under the Aaronic system. And so, in fact, the author of Hebrews in a later chapter is going to be talking about that in some more detail. And so Jesus couldn't have been a priest in the Aaronic system under that covenant because he wasn't from the right tribe. But he was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So that's why it's important to make this distinction. And this is why Melchizedek becomes so important to the whole story and becomes a thing that the Jews had to deal with when Christians started claiming that Jesus was was that fulfillment of that psalmist prophecy and how he was in the image of Melchizedek. So I hope that helps you understand who Melchizedek is. A hardly mentioned character in the Old Testament turns out to be a big player in the New Testament. Okay, so we're back to Hebrews now. We've covered that whole Melchizedek for the moment, but it's going to come back, as I said. The author of Hebrews here is going to have quite a bit to say about who Melchizedek was. And despite those very few verses, he manages to turn them into quite a bit of information. But we'll get to that in its time. So Hebrews 5:7-9 continues on, and it says, while also Yeshua was clothed in the flesh, he offered prayers, supplications, strong shouting, and tears to him who was able to give him life from death, and he was obeyed. And although he is the Son, he learned obedience by the fear and the suffering which he endured. And in this way he was perfected, and became the cause of eternal life to all those who obey him. Now, as you can see, I've highlighted some things in yellow there. This idea of obedience is being used in different ways here. It's talking about Jesus making requests and prayers, supplications in prayer, and these things. And it says that he was obeyed. Now, we wouldn't use the word obeyed that way. We would say his requests were granted. But the author here, in his language, obeyed is the word that they would use here. And so his requests were obeyed, says the author. But it says also, although he was the Son of God, he learned obedience himself. And then he talks later about he will bring the eternal life to all of those who obey him. So three different references to obedience in these verses, all talking about how the importance of obedience and that Jesus himself had to learn obedience. And how did he learn obedience? He learned obedience by the fear and the suffering which he endured. And we do the same thing. These things that we suffer in this life, and we do suffer. We may not suffer as much as the early Christians suffer with the direct persecutions and executions that they suffered, But nonetheless, we suffer in this world. We are tempted. The Satan is always trying to deceive us. And that is the suffering that's been talked about here and in Hebrews in the past. And so it talks not just about that learning obedience, but he says, in this way, Jesus himself was perfected. Okay? So we also perfect ourselves through these experiences that we go through, this life that we lead here, the trials that we have to endure. Those are the things that make us better, make us stronger. And the author is going to talk more about perfection in later chapters here. So Jesus himself learned obedience by fear and suffering, which seems like an odd way to learn obedience, but nonetheless, that's one of the times when obedience is hardest. When people are teasing you about being a Christian or mocking you for being a Christian, it's hard to be obedient sometimes. And that's and sometimes if they're threatening your job or threatening your position, threatening something about your character, maybe even threatening your life, those are the times when obedience is the hardest. And as it was with Jesus, when they were mocking him, making fun of him, that was the time when obedience needed to continue despite the fear and suffering. And so he was perfected through all of that. So he's kind of the role model for us in all of that suffering and fear and perfection that we go through in our lives. Okay, continuing on. Two verses here in chapter 5. I put them together, although they're not exactly together. And verse 10 says, and he was named the high priest by God in the image of Melchizedek. So this is where Hebrews refers back to Melchizedek again. And it says, but about this Melchizedek, I have much to say, but it is hard to explain it because you have bad hearing. So he begins by talking about Jesus being a priest like Melchizedek, a point that he's going to continue on with. But then he pauses to take a swipe at his audience. Now, this is something most speakers won't do, but he actually says, I would tell you all about this Melchizedek, but it's hard to explain because you're not really able to listen. You're bad hearing. And he's not talking about physical hearing. He's talking about bad spiritual hearing. And we've talked about this before, that the Hebrew church was obviously suffering from backsliding. They had begun to lose faith, and a lot of this epistle is dealing with the loss of faith, like we saw last week, and other things that they're suffering from. And so he says, I would like to tell you all these sort of things more about this, but you aren't really able to hear them. And he continues on with this bad mouthing of his audience by saying, and some of this I quoted earlier when we were doing this Hebrew study. For you ought to be teachers because of the time you've had in the doctrine. But now, again, you need to learn these things, which are the primer letters of the first words of God, and you have need of milk and not of solid food. But every person whose food is milk is unacquainted with the word of righteousness, because he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, those whose senses are instructed to distinguish good and evil, because they practice. So what he's saying there, I think, should be obvious to us, and we shouldn't need to be told this again. But spiritual milk is for infants. When an infant needs milk to grow and isn't ready for solid food. And when he says, when you're a spiritual infant in the church, you don't understand all of God's righteousness. You don't understand good from evil. You aren't able to make those distinctions. You're just an infant and you're learning the basic things. Um, but he says solid food is for the mature, the ones who are trained in what is right and wrong, and they practice and they know how to distinguish good from evil. And so he's saying that you people in the Hebrew church are, you know, still in need of milk. You're not really ready for solid food. And because of that, you aren't able to hear some of the things that I'm trying to tell you. Okay, and so we're pretty close to wrapping up for today. Um, So now we're into Hebrews 6, and we'll just kind of scratch this a little bit. We're going to continue on with what he's saying about the people in the Hebrew church. And he says, because of this, let us leave the beginning of the message. The beginning of the message has been everything up until this. He's done all this who is Jesus stuff, who in relation to God and the angels and Moses, we saw all of that. And so he says, so now let us leave the beginning of the message of the Messiah and let us go on to perfection. So he's going to change the message now from those beginning introductory things. Now he's going to go on to living a life to perfection. And he says, and he takes a swipe at them again. He says, or are you laying again another foundation for conversion from dead works and faith in God? And so he says, again, takes a swipe at them. You've kind of lost your foundational faith and you're beginning to fall away into false beliefs, you need to watch out for that. So he lays down a list of possible topics that he's going to cover in the future. And what he says here is conversion from dead works and for faith in God, for the teaching of baptism, the laying on of hands, for the resurrection from among the dead, and for eternal judgment. And then he says, we shall do all this. We shall cover all of this if the Lord Yahweh permits. So if God permits him to include this in this epistle, it will be in this epistle. And so we understand that from all of the writers of the epistles is that they were doing what God wanted them to do in these. They were saying what God wanted them to say. And the words that were included were God's words, and the words that weren't included were not included because God didn't want them included. And that's the way it is for all of the epistles, is that they are written by the hand of God through men. Okay, so next week, he's going to go into the idea of losing your salvation. And in our society today, we've often heard this, you can't lose your salvation. You can't, once you're saved, always saved, is the idea that it's often worded as. And he's going to talk about this, yes, you can lose your salvation. He's going to say, yes, that happens. But this is just a light version in chapter 6. In chapter 10, he's going to really get into that subject and explain it in more detail. That, yes, you can lose your salvation, no doubt about it. But he says, God will not forget your works. And he's going to spend some time on that whole idea of God loves you and doesn't forget the good things you've done. Then he ties that into salvation as well. So those are the things that we'll be covering next week.